Three adult kids lock an elderly couple in a basement during a storm blackout, and these aren't strangers. They're the couple's own children. As the power goes out and the storm rages, water starts pouring through the foundation, and the couple realizes this isn't an accident. Through the floorboards, they hear something that stops their hearts: laughter. Their children are laughing, waiting for them to break, waiting for them to sign over everything they own just to be let out. Robert and Elaine Whitmore had been married for 47 years, and in all that time, they had never once gone to bed angry. It was a promise they'd made on their wedding night in 1977, standing in the reception hall of the First Methodist Church in Cedarbrook, Pennsylvania. Both of them young and foolish, and absolutely certain that love would be enough to carry them through anything. They were right about that, though not in the way they'd imagined. Now Robert was 73, and Elaine was 71, and they lived in the same house they'd raised their children in, a modest two-story colonial on Maple Street, with a basement that flooded when it rained too hard, and a furnace that made strange sounds every winter. The house needed work. It had needed work for years, but Robert had stopped being able to climb ladders a decade ago, and hiring someone required money they'd given to their children long before they should have. 3 children: Michael, the eldest, a financial advisor in Philadelphia; Susan, the middle child, a real estate agent who'd moved to New Jersey; and David, the baby, though he was 41 years old now and hadn't been a baby in any meaningful sense for longer than Robert cared to calculate. Robert still woke at 5:30 every morning. He made coffee the old-fashioned way, with a percolator that had belonged to his mother, and he sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, even though his eyes weren't what they used to be, and most of the news made him sad. Elaine rose an hour later, moving carefully down the stairs with one hand on the railing, her joints protesting the indignity of another day. She had her tea, Earl Grey with honey, and she did the crossword puzzle, while Robert watched the morning news with the volume too loud because neither of them could hear the way they used to. The storm arrived on a Thursday in late October, though the weathermen had been warning about it since Monday. Major system moving in, they'd said, with that peculiar mix of concern and excitement that meteorologists seem to cultivate. Could be the biggest storm of the decade. Residents should prepare for power outages, flooding, and dangerous conditions. Robert had done what he could. He'd checked the sump pump in the basement, the one he'd installed himself 30 years ago when water had first started seeping through the foundation. He'd cleared the storm drains in front of the house, moving slowly because his back wouldn't let him move any other way. He'd filled the bathtub with water, just in case, and made sure they had candles and flashlights and batteries. Elaine had stocked up on groceries during her weekly trip to the market, adding extra bread and canned goods to her cart with the pragmatic efficiency of a woman who had weathered many storms before. They were ready, or as ready as 2 people in their 70s could be for what was coming. The rain started around noon on Thursday, gentle at first, almost pleasant. Robert stood at the kitchen window watching it fall, remembering how he used to take the kids outside during summer storms, teaching them not to fear the thunder but to count the seconds between flash and boom. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. By evening, the gentle rain had become a deluge. Wind howled around the corners of the house, rattling windows and making the old structure creak in ways Robert hadn't heard in years. The power flickered at 7 o'clock, then again at 7:15, then went out completely at 7:30, plunging them into darkness. "Well," Elaine said from her chair in the living room, her voice calm and dry, "I suppose we're in it now." Robert lit candles, the emergency ones they kept in the kitchen drawer, and brought one to Elaine. The flame cast dancing shadows on her face, and for a moment she looked young again, like the girl he'd married when they were both too naive to know what marriage would require of them. "I love you," he said, because he always said it when he felt it, which was often. "I love you too," she replied, reaching for his hand. "Now stop being maudlin and find us something to eat. I'm hungry." They were heating soup on the camping stove when headlights appeared in the driveway. Robert peered through the rain-streaked window, squinting at the 2 vehicles pulling up to the house. He recognized Michael's BMW and Susan's SUV, their shapes familiar even through the storm. "The kids are here," he said. surprise evident in his voice. Elaine set down her spoon and came to stand beside him. All of them? Looks like it. David's car is pulling in behind Susan's. Maybe they were worried about us, Elaine offered. Maybe, Robert said. He went to open the front door, and the wind nearly tore it from his hands. Rain lashed the porch, soaking his slippers before he could step back. Through the chaos, he saw his children emerging from their cars, hunched against the storm, running toward the house. Michael reached the porch first, shaking water from his expensive coat. "Dad," he said. "Good, you're awake. We need to talk." Susan and David followed close behind, both of them wet and windblown. Susan was 43, polished even in the middle of a storm, her blonde hair plastered to her face, but her expression controlled. David, the youngest, had always been the softest of the three, but tonight his eyes held something hard that Robert didn't recognize. Come in, Elaine said, already reaching for towels. "You must be freezing. What on earth are you all doing here in this weather?" "We came because we needed to talk about the house," Michael said. His voice was the same one he used in business meetings. "The house?" Robert frowned. "What about it?" "And you can't stay here anymore, Dad. It's not safe." Elaine's hand found Robert's in the darkness. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly. "Not safe?" she repeated. "This is our home. We've lived here for 43 years. "That's the problem," Susan said. "The house is old. It needs more repairs than you can afford. And frankly, the two of you aren't capable of taking care of yourselves anymore. We've been discussing it, and we think it's time you moved into assisted living." Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach, something that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "You've been discussing it," he said slowly. "The three of you. Without us. We didn't want to worry you until we had a plan," David said, but he wouldn't meet Robert's eyes. "A plan," Robert repeated. "And what exactly is this plan?" "There's a facility in Harrisburg, Pine Valley Senior Living. They have availability, and we've already put down a deposit. You'd have a nice apartment, meals provided, medical staff on site. It's the best thing for everyone." "Everyone," Elaine said quietly. "Or just the three of you? What happens to the house?" Robert asked. Michael had the grace to look uncomfortable. "We'd sell it, split the proceeds 3 ways. It's only fair, Dad. You're sitting on equity you can't use, and we all have families, mortgages, expenses. You want to sell our home?" Elaine interrupted, her voice harder than Robert had heard it in years. "And put us in a facility so you can take the money. That's not—" "Don't." Elaine held up one hand. "Don't insult me by pretending this is about our welfare. We raised you better than this. At least I thought we did." "Look," Susan said, her tone shifting to something softer, more conciliatory. "We don't have to decide anything tonight. Let's just all calm down and—" Thunder crashed directly overhead, so loud it shook the house. The lights, which had been off for an hour already, somehow seemed to get darker. Rain began hammering the roof with renewed fury. "The basement," David said suddenly. "We should check the basement. Didn't you say it floods, Dad?" Robert nodded slowly. "The sump pump handles it. I checked it this morning. But with the power out, the pump won't work," Michael pointed out. "We should get down there. Make sure water isn't coming in. I can check it myself." "Don't be stubborn, Dad. You can barely get down those stairs. Let us help." "Actually," Michael continued, "both of you should come down with us. If there's flooding, we might need to move things. And it's safer than staying up here if the storm gets worse." "Safer?" Robert frowned. "The basement is below ground level. If a tree falls on the house, you're better off down there." It made sense. It made perfect logical sense. And yet, something about the way his children were looking at each other, the way they kept glancing toward the basement door, made Robert's skin prickle with unease. Elaine squeezed his hand. When he looked at her, she gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. But Susan was already opening the basement door, and David was gently taking Elaine's elbow, and Michael was positioning himself behind Robert in a way that felt more like hurting than helping. "Come on," Michael said. "The stairs are steep. I'll be right behind you." Robert descended first, one hand on the railing, moving slowly in the darkness. Behind him, he could hear Elaine's careful footsteps, and behind her, the heavier tread of their children. The basement was cold and damp, the way it always got during storms. Robert could hear water dripping somewhere, the sump pump sitting silent and useless without power. The flashlight beam swept across familiar shapes, the old workbench where he'd taught Michael to use a hammer, the storage shelves Elaine had organized and reorganized a dozen times, the camping gear they hadn't used in 20 years but couldn't bear to throw away. "See?" Michael said from the stairs. "Water's already coming in. We got down here just in time." Robert turned to look at his son, but Michael was already retreating up the stairs. Susan and David followed, their footsteps quick and purposeful. "Wait," Elaine called out. "Where are you going?" "We need to check something upstairs," Susan said. Her voice was strange, too bright, too cheerful. "You two stay down there where it's safe. We'll be right back." The basement door swung closed, and then Robert heard a sound that stopped his heart, the distinctive click of the deadbolt sliding home. The same deadbolt he'd installed 15 years ago to keep the kids from playing in the basement unsupervised. "Robert?" Elaine's voice was barely a whisper. He climbed the stairs as fast as his old legs would carry him, reaching the door and grabbing the handle. It didn't move. He pushed, pulled, rattled it with all his strength. Locked, from above, through the heavy wooden door, he heard voices, his children's voices, and they were laughing. "What do you think they'll do?" That was Susan. "Probably panic," Michael said. "The old man will try to break down the door. Bet you $20. "That's cruel," David said, but he was laughing too. "God, did you see their faces when we started talking about the house? Doesn't matter. By morning they'll agree to anything. A night down there in the cold and dark, scared out of their minds, and they'll sign whatever papers we put in front of them." "And if they don't?" Susan asked. "Then we tell the authorities we're concerned about their mental state, that we found them confused and disoriented during the storm, that they locked themselves in the basement by accident. Either way, we get what we need." The voices faded as the children moved away from the door, deeper into the house. Into the house Robert had bought with money he'd earned through 40 years of backbreaking work. The house where he'd carried each of his children through the front door for the first time. The house where he'd thought he would die, surrounded by the people he loved. Robert stood at the top of the stairs, his hand still on the useless door handle, listening to the storm rage outside and something much darker rage inside his own chest. "Robert?" Elaine was at the bottom of the stairs, her face ghostly in the weak beam of the flashlight. "What's happening?" He descended slowly, each step feeling like a mile. "They've locked us in," he said quietly. "They're going to leave us down here until we agree to give them the house." Elaine was silent for a long moment. Then, impossibly, she smiled. "Well," she said, "they clearly don't know us very well, do they?" Despite everything, Robert felt his lips twitch toward a smile of his own. "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose they do." From somewhere beyond the walls, water began to pour through a crack in the foundation, pooling on the concrete floor. The storm was getting worse. The basement was flooding. They were locked in with no phone, no power, and children who had just proven themselves capable of something Robert had never imagined. But they had each other, 47 years of each other. The first thing Robert did was take stock of their situation. It was instinct, the same instinct that had carried him through 40 years at the steel mill, where panic killed faster than the machinery. He moved the flashlight slowly across the basement, cataloging what they had. The old workbench against the far wall, covered with tools he hadn't touched in years, but had never been able to throw away. The storage shelves are lined with plastic bins, labeled in Elaine's careful handwriting: Christmas decorations, kids' report cards, tax returns, 1,985 to 1,995. The camping gear in the corner, purchased for family vacations that had stopped happening 2 decades ago. The water heater, the furnace, the silent sump pump, and the water. It was coming in through a crack in the foundation, near the corner where the wall met the floor. Robert had patched that crack a dozen times over the years, but concrete was stubborn and water was patient, and eventually the water always won. Right now, the stream was about the width of his thumb, not much. But the storm was far from over, and Robert knew from experience how quickly that trickle could become a torrent. "How bad is it?" Elaine asked, coming to stand beside him. "Bad enough. The sump pump's useless without power, and that crack is only going to get worse as the ground saturates." "Can you fix it?" Temporarily, I mean. I can try, he said. I've got materials down here somewhere. The question is whether these old hands can do what needs doing. Your hands have never failed me yet, Robert Whitmore. I don't expect them to start now. He kissed her palm, a gesture so automatic it required no thought, and went to the workbench. The tools were exactly where he'd left them, dusty but functional. His father's hammer, the head worn smooth from decades of use. A set of screwdrivers in various sizes, pliers, wrenches, a handsaw with a blade that needed replacing. And in the cabinet beneath the bench, the supplies he'd accumulated over 43 years of home ownership, tubes of caulk, cans of waterproof sealant, a bag of hydraulic cement that might or might not still be usable. Robert gathered what he needed and carried it to the corner where the water was coming in. The stream had widened already, now as thick as 2 fingers pressed together. The pool spreading across the floor had reached the bottom of the storage shelves. We need to move those bins, he said, nodding toward the shelves. The ones on the bottom will be ruined if we don't. I'll handle it, Elaine said. You focus on the crack. He wanted to protest, to tell her that moving heavy bins was too much for her arthritis, too much strain on her back, but he knew better. Elaine had never responded well to being told what she couldn't do. And right now, they needed every bit of strength they had. He knelt on the cold concrete, his knees screaming in protest, and examined the crack by flashlight. It was worse than he'd thought. The old patches had failed completely, creating a channel through which groundwater was pouring with increasing force. Okay, he muttered to himself, a habit from years of working alone in this basement. Okay, let's see what we can do. He opened the bag of hydraulic cement and was relieved to find it hadn't completely hardite. The powder was clumpy but workable. He mixed it with water from the puddle at his feet, creating a thick paste that he pressed into the crack with his bare hands. The cement was supposed to set quickly, even in wet conditions. That was the whole point of hydraulic cement. But the water pressure was fighting him, pushing the paste back out of the crack almost as fast as he could apply it. Come on, he grunted, pressing harder. Come on, you stubborn Robert. Elaine's voice cut through his frustration. Listen. He paused, his hand still pressed against the wall, and listened. At first, all he could hear was the storm, the rain hammering the house above, the wind howling like something alive and angry. But then, beneath those sounds, he heard something else, laughter and music. Their children had turned on the radio, some station playing classic rock, the kind of music Michael had loved when he was a teenager. And they were laughing, all 3 of them, their voices drifting down through the floorboards as if they hadn't a care in the world. Robert felt something surge in his chest, something hot and dark that he hadn't felt in years. Rage. Pure, undiluted rage. Those ungrateful. He stopped himself before the words could fully form. He wouldn't say it, wouldn't give voice to the poison spreading through his heart. Let them laugh, Elaine said quietly. She had moved 3 bins to higher ground and was working on a 4th, moving slowly but steadily. They think they know how this ends. They're wrong. How can you be so calm? They're our children, Elaine. We raised them. We gave them everything. I know what we gave them. Her voice was steady, but Robert could hear the steel beneath it. I also know what they've become. Those aren't the children we raised, Robert. Somewhere along the way, we lost them. Or maybe we never had them to begin with. Maybe we just couldn't see what they were becoming because we loved them too much to look at them clearly. The signs had been there for years. Michael's coldness, his way of reducing everything to transactions and bottom lines. Susan's careful manipulations, the way she always seemed to get what she wanted while making others feel grateful for giving it to her. David's weakness, his willingness to follow wherever his siblings led, even when the path was wrong. They had raised 3 children, and all 3 had grown into people Robert didn't recognize. People who could lock their elderly parents in a flooding basement and laugh about it. Where had he gone wrong? Stop, Elaine said, and Robert realized he'd been standing motionless, lost in thought, while the water continued to rise. Whatever you're thinking, stop. We don't have time for guilt or grief, or any of the things you're feeling right now. We can feel those things later, after we survive this. Right now, I need you here, with me, working. Robert turned back to the crack and resumed his work. The first layer of hydraulic cement had set slightly, giving him a foundation to build on. He applied more, pressing it deep into the gap, smoothing it with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. The flow of water slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. "It's working," he said. "Of course it's working. You know what you're doing, Robert. You've always known." He applied a third layer, then a fourth. By the time he was finished, the crack was completely sealed, and the stream of water had been reduced to a trickle of seepage that dampened the concrete but no longer flowed. But he knew this was only a temporary victory. The patch would hold for a while, maybe a few hours, maybe longer, but the pressure was building outside those walls. Eventually, the water would find another way in. "We need to check the rest of the foundation," he said, pushing himself to his feet with a groan. His knees felt like they were made of broken glass, and his back had joined in the chorus of complaint. "If there are other weak points, we need to find them before they give way." Together, they circled the basement, Robert holding the flashlight while Elaine watched for signs of moisture. They found two more potential problem areas: a small crack near the old coal chute and a section of wall where the mortar between the cinder blocks was crumbling. Robert patched them both, using the last of the hydraulic cement and most of his remaining strength. By the time he finished, his hands were raw and bleeding from the rough concrete, and the pile of supplies on the workbench had dwindled to almost nothing. But the basement was holding, for now. "We need to get off the floor," Elaine said, looking at the water that had pooled across nearly half the basement. "Even if it doesn't rise much more, standing in cold water for hours will give us hypothermia." She was right. The water was only a few inches deep, but it was frigid, and Robert's feet had gone numb inside his wet slippers. "The workbench," he said. "It's solid wood, reinforced. It'll hold both of us." They cleared the bench together, moving tools and supplies to higher shelves. Then Robert helped Elaine climb up, supporting her as she settled onto the worn wooden surface. He followed, his joints protesting every movement, and finally they were both sitting side by side, their feet dangling above the water, their backs against the cold basement wall. "How long do you think until morning?" Elaine asked. Robert checked his watch, tilting it toward the flashlight beam. "It's just past 10. 6, maybe 7 hours until dawn. We can survive 7 hours." "Yes, we can." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm and the water and the occasional burst of laughter from above. The flashlight batteries wouldn't last all night, so they'd turned it off to conserve power, plunging themselves into a darkness so complete that Robert couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. But he could feel Elaine beside him, her shoulder pressed against his, her hand finding his in the darkness, her breathing slow and steady. 47 years of marriage, and still her presence was enough to make him feel like everything would be all right. "Do you remember?" Elaine said quietly. "The blackout of 1985? Robert smiled despite everything. "The one where Michael was convinced the world was ending? He was 10. Susan was 8. David was only 4. And you stubborn fool, insisted on driving to the hardware store in the middle of the power outage to get flashlight batteries because you said we couldn't just sit in the dark like helpless people. I was gone for 2 hours. The traffic was impossible. And when you came back, you found all 3 kids asleep in the living room, wrapped in blankets, with candles lit around them like it was some kind of camping adventure. Do you remember what Susan said when you walked in?" Robert's throat tightened. She said, "Mommy made the scary dark into a fun dark." I've been making scary darks into fun darks for 47 years, Robert. This one is no different. It's just bigger. It's very different, Elaine. Our children made a choice. A terrible, unforgivable choice. But that choice is about them, not about us. It doesn't change who we are. It doesn't change what we can survive. We have been through hard things before, and we have always come through together. Those hard things didn't involve our own kids trying to... He couldn't say the word, couldn't give voice to the horror of what his children had done. I know. Elaine's voice cracked for the first time, revealing the pain she'd been hiding beneath her calm. I know what they're doing. I know what it means, and I know that after tonight, nothing will ever be the same between us and them. But Robert, we can't let that break us. We can't let their cruelty define our story. We decide how this ends, not them. Us. How does it end? He asked. It ends with us walking out of this basement tomorrow morning, under our own power, with our dignity intact. It ends with us looking our children in the eye and letting them see that they failed, that they couldn't break us, that all their scheming and cruelty and betrayal wasn't enough to destroy what we have. And then we decide what comes next. But not tonight. Tonight, we survive. That's all we have to do. Just survive until morning. From above, the music changed. The classic rock station had switched to something softer, a love song from the 70s that Robert recognized but couldn't name. He wondered if his children were still awake up there, or if they'd gone to bed in the comfortable rooms of the house they were trying to steal. He wondered if they felt any guilt at all. "Talk to me," Elaine said. "Tell me a story. Help me stay warm." Robert thought for a moment, searching his memory for something worth telling. And then he smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Did I ever tell you about the first time I saw you? You've told me 100 times. Tell me what I told you." Elaine laughed softly, a sound that warmed the darkness more than any fire could have. "You said you were walking home from work, and you saw a girl sitting on the steps of the public library, reading a book. And you said the sunlight was hitting her hair in a way that made it look like she was wearing a crown of gold. And you said you knew, right then, that you were going to marry her." "That's not what I said. That's exactly what you said." "I was there. I said all of that, yes. But I didn't tell you the most important part." "What was the most important part?" Robert reached out in the darkness and found her face, cupping her cheek in his cold, roughened hand. "The most important part was what happened after I saw you. I walked past. I was too scared to talk to you. I went home, ate dinner, and I went to bed. And I couldn't sleep all night because I kept thinking about the girl on the library steps. And I promised myself that if I ever saw you again, I wouldn't walk past. I'd be brave. I'd say something." "And did you say something?" "I went to the library every day for 2 weeks before I saw you again. And when I finally did, do you know what I said? You said, 'Excuse me, but I think you dropped something.' And you said, I said, 'I didn't drop anything.' And you said, 'I know. I just couldn't think of anything else to say.'" They both laughed, the sound echoing off the basement walls, briefly drowning out the storm and the water and the horror of what their children had done. "I married a smooth talker," Elaine said. "You married a fool who was brave enough to admit he was a fool. There's a difference." "There is. I've always appreciated the difference." The water level had stabilized, Robert realized. The patches were holding, and while the rain continued to pound the house above, no new streams had appeared along the foundation. They were cold and uncomfortable and trapped, but they were not in immediate danger. They would survive the night. "Robert?" Elaine's voice was drowsy now, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "Yes? When we get out of here, I don't want to see them. I can't. Not yet. You won't have to. And I don't want to give them the house. I know that's what they want. I know that's why they did this. But I worked too hard for this home. We worked too hard. I'm not giving it to people who would lock us in a basement to take it. We won't give them anything," Robert said firmly. "Not the house. Not our dignity. Not a single thing they haven't earned. They haven't earned anything. No, they haven't." Elaine's head settled against his shoulder, her breathing growing slow and even. Robert stayed awake, watching over her, listening to the storm gradually begin to fade as the worst of it passed over. The night stretched on, cold and dark, and seemingly endless. But Robert had weathered worse. He'd worked night shifts at the steel mill, 12 hours of backbreaking labor in conditions that would kill a lesser man. He'd held his father's hand as he died, sat through the long nights of his children's illnesses, endured the quiet agony of watching his body slowly fail him. This was just another night, harder than some, easier than others. And when it was over, when the sun finally rose, he and Elaine would walk out of this basement together. He didn't know what would come after that. He didn't know how he would face his children, or what he would say, or whether the relationships could ever be repaired. He didn't know if he even wanted them repaired, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would not be broken by this. Not by the storm, not by the water, and not by the three people they had loved more than life itself. Their children had underestimated them. They had seen two old people and assumed they were weak, fragile, easily manipulated. Robert didn't sleep. He couldn't, not with Elaine depending on him, not with the water still pooling beneath them and the cold seeping into his bones with every passing hour. Instead, he sat in the darkness and listened to his wife's breathing, slow and steady beside him, listening to the storm gradually exhaust itself, the rain softening from a roar to a murmur, to something that was almost gentle. Listened to the old house creak and settle above him, the bones of the building he'd called home for more than 4 decades, and he listened to the silence from upstairs, where his children had apparently gone to bed, while their parents sat trapped in a flooding basement. Robert turned the thought over in his mind, examining it from every angle, trying to find some explanation that didn't make his children into monsters. He couldn't find one. Around 2 in the morning, Elaine stirred against his shoulder. "Robert, are you awake? I'm here. What time is it?" He checked his watch, tilting it toward the faint glow of the flashlight he'd turned on at its lowest setting. "Just past 2. 4 more hours until sunrise. How's the water?" "Stable," he said. "We're okay." Elaine sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her joints. "I need to move. My back is seizing up." "Careful. The bench isn't wide enough for walking around." "I know. I just need to stretch." She shifted position, extending her legs, rotating her ankles, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to negotiate with her own body's limitations. Robert watched her in the dim light, marveling as he always did at her resilience. Elaine had never been delicate. She'd worked as a nurse for 35 years, lifting patients twice her size, working double shifts during flu seasons and emergencies, coming home with her feet swollen and her back aching only to cook dinner and help the kids with homework. She'd had 2 hip replacements and a knee surgery, and she'd recovered from each one faster than the doctors predicted. "You're staring at me?" she said without looking up. "I'm admiring you. Admire me in the morning, when I've had coffee and a hot shower. Right now, I'm a mess. You're the most beautiful mess I've ever seen." She laughed, a short, surprised sound that echoed in the darkness. 47 years, and you're still trying to charm me. Is it working?" "It's always working. That's the problem." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only long marriages could produce. No need for words, no need for explanation. Just 2 people existing together in the same space, drawing strength from each other's presence. Then Elaine said, "I've been thinking about Michael." Robert's stomach tightened. "What about him?" "About when he changed. When he stopped being our son and became this." "Elaine, I think it was graduate school, business school. He went in wanting to help people manage their money, and he came out believing that money was the only thing that mattered. Do you remember how he talked when he visited during that first Christmas break? All those words I didn't understand. Leverage, equity, return on investment. He looked at everything like it was a transaction. He was young. He was learning a new language. He was learning a new way of seeing the world, a way that turned people into numbers on a spreadsheet. Elaine's voice was heavy with grief, and we let it happen. We were so proud of him, getting into that fancy school, landing that big job. We didn't see what it was costing him." Robert wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself and his wife against the accusation of failure, but he couldn't, because she was right. They were proud. So proud that their son was succeeding in a world that had always felt slightly out of their reach. They'd told everyone about Michael's accomplishments, his promotions, his growing wealth. They'd never stopped to ask whether success was making him happy, or whether the person he was becoming was someone they wanted him to be. "Susan was different," Elaine continued. "She was always calculating, even as a child. Do you remember how she used to negotiate her allowance? How she'd play her brothers against each other to get what she wanted? I thought it was clever. It was clever. It was also manipulative, and we praised her for it because we thought she'd need those skills to survive in a man's world. We never taught her the difference between being smart and being cruel. And David," Elaine sighed, David just wanted to be loved. He followed his siblings because he didn't know how to stand on his own. We should have helped him find his backbone. Instead, we let Michael and Susan do his thinking for him. We did our best, Elaine. Did we? Or did we do what was easy and call it our best? Robert didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. The questions Elaine was asking were ones he'd been avoiding for years, maybe decades. Questions about whether they'd failed their children or whether their children had simply become who they were always going to become, regardless of what their parents did. It doesn't matter now, Elaine said finally. Whatever mistakes we made, we can't unmake them. What matters is what we do next. What do we do next? We survive this night, and then we start over. Start over? At our age? Why not? We're not dead yet, Robert. We have years left, God willing. Maybe those years don't include our children anymore. Maybe that's the price we pay for whatever we did wrong. But we can still make those years mean something. We can still choose how we want to live. Before Robert could respond, a new sound interrupted them. A low, ominous gurgle from the corner of the basement. He grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the source of the sound. His heart sank. The crack he'd patched earlier, the biggest one, was failing. Water was seeping around the edges of the hydraulic cement, pushing through with a pressure that was slowly but surely undermining his repair work. Robert? Elaine's voice was calm, but he could hear the fear beneath it. The patch is giving way. The ground must be completely saturated by now. There's nowhere for the water to go except through our foundation. Can you fix it again? I used all the cement. There's nothing left. They stared at the failing patch, watching the seepage increase, watching the water begin to stream down the wall and pool on the floor. Within minutes, the level had risen to cover their toes where they dangled from the workbench. What do we do? Elaine asked. Robert's mind raced through the possibilities. They could bang on the floor, trying to get their children's attention. But would the children even respond? Or would they assume it was just their parents panicking, exactly as they'd predicted? They could try to break down the door, but the stairs were steep and slippery, and Robert's body wasn't capable of the kind of force that would be required. He'd more likely fall and break a hip than break through that heavy wooden door. They could wait and hope the storm had passed enough that the water would start receding. Hope the patch would hold a little longer. Hope for a miracle. Robert didn't believe in miracles, but he did believe in refusing to give up. The camping gear, he said suddenly. In the corner. Is it still above water? Elaine shone the flashlight toward the pile of equipment they hadn't touched in 20 years. The water was lapping at the edges, but most of it was still dry. Barely. Why? The air mattress. The inflatable one we bought for that trip to Yellowstone. What about it? Help me get it. Robert slid off the workbench, gasping as the cold water hit his legs. It was deeper than he'd realized, almost to his knees now, and the shock of it nearly buckled him. But Elaine was beside him in an instant, her hand gripping his arm, steadying him. Together, they waded to the corner and dug through the camping gear. Sleeping bags, wet and ruined. A camp stove they'd never used. And there, at the bottom of the pile, the air mattress in its carrying case. It's still sealed, Robert said, relief flooding through him. The plastic kept it dry. But how does an air mattress help us? We can't float out of here. No, but we can use it to stay above the water. Even if the whole floor floods, if we can inflate this, we can stay dry. The pump is electric. There's a manual backup. A hand pump. I insisted on it because I didn't trust the batteries. They found the hand pump in the bottom of the case, a simple bellows device that required nothing but human effort to operate. Robert handed it to Elaine. You pump. I'll try to shore up the patch. Buy us more time. With what? You said you're out of cement. Robert looked around the basement, his mind cataloging everything within reach, and then his eyes landed on something he'd forgotten about entirely. The old coal chute. When they'd bought the house in 1981, it had still had a coal furnace. Robert had converted it to gas himself, but the coal chute had remained, sealed with a heavy iron door that was now rusted shut. Behind that door was a small storage space where he'd kept bags of sand for winter ice removal. Sand, mixed with water, it would make a crude but effective barrier. Keep pumping, he told Elaine. I have an idea. He waded across the basement to the coal chute, fighting against water that was now up to his thighs and rising. The cold was beyond painful, a deep, bone-aching numbness that made his legs feel like they belonged to someone else. But he kept moving, because stopping wasn't an option. The iron door was rusted, just as he remembered. He grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing. He pulled again, harder, feeling something in his shoulder protest violently. Still nothing. "Come on," he growled through gritted teeth. "Come on, you stubborn!" The door gave way with a screech of corroded metal, swinging open so suddenly that Robert stumbled backward and nearly fell. He caught himself on the wall, breathing hard, his heart racing. Inside the coal chute, exactly where he'd left them 2 years ago, were 3 bags of sand. He grabbed the first bag and hauled it toward the failing patch. The bag weighed 50 pounds, maybe more, and his arms screamed at the effort. But he got it there, ripping the bag open and piling sand against the base of the wall, creating a barrier that the water would have to push through. One bag, then another, then the third. By the time he finished, the patch was reinforced with a wall of sand that wouldn't stop the water entirely, but would slow it significantly. And the water level, he realized, had stopped rising. "Robert!" Elaine called out. "The mattress is ready!" He turned to see her standing on the inflated air mattress, which floated on the water like a small rubber island. She reached out her hand to help him aboard. "Come on, you've done enough. Rest now." Robert waded to her and let her pull him onto the mattress. It dipped under their combined weight, but held, keeping them above the water that now covered everything below waist height. They lay side by side, staring up at the ceiling they couldn't see, breathing hard, but breathing together. "That was impressive," Elaine said after a long moment. "The sand. I'd forgotten that it was there. 43 years in this house. I know every inch of it." They forgot that. They forgot a lot of things. Robert reached for her hand in the darkness. Her fingers were cold, like his, but they squeezed back with surprising strength. "How long until morning?" she asked. He checked his watch. 3 hours. Maybe a little less. "We're going to make it." "Yes, we are." They lay in silence, floating on a rubber mattress in their flooded basement. 2 old people who had been betrayed by the children they'd raised and loved. And somehow, despite everything, Robert felt something that might have been peace. They had survived, not because of luck or miracles or the mercy of their children, but because of who they were, because of what 47 years of marriage had built between them. Their children had tried to break them, and their children had failed. The dawn came slowly, light creeping through the small basement windows that sat at ground level, turning the darkness gray and then pale yellow. The storm had passed entirely now, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. Robert woke from a sleep he hadn't meant to fall into, his body stiff and aching from hours on the air mattress. Beside him, Elaine was already awake, watching the light grow. "Good morning," she said quietly. "Morning." He sat up slowly, groaning at the protest from every joint in his body. "What time is it?" "Just past 7. I've been awake for an hour." Robert looked around the basement, taking stock in the growing light. The water had receded somewhat, down from thigh-high to knee-high, still too deep to walk through comfortably, but no longer dangerous. His sand barrier had held, and the patch behind it seemed stable for now. "We should try the door," Elaine said. "It'll still be locked." "I know, but we should try anyway. Let them know we're alive. Let them know we're coming up." Robert understood what she meant. This wasn't about escape anymore. This was about sending a message. He slid off the mattress into the cold water, steadying himself against the wall. Then he helped Elaine down, and together they waded across the basement to the stairs. The climb was harder than Robert expected. His legs had stiffened during the night, and each step sent sharp pains through his knees and hips. But Elaine was beside him, one hand on the railing and one hand on his arm, and together they made it to the top. Robert tried the handle, still locked, as he'd known it would be. He looked at Elaine. She nodded. He knocked on the door, not frantically, not desperately. Just 3 firm, measured knocks, the kind a visitor might make when arriving for a scheduled appointment. Silence from the other side. He knocked again. 3 more knocks, patient, controlled, footsteps. Then a voice, muffled through the wood. "Dad?" It was Michael. "Is that you?" Robert didn't answer. He simply waited. More footsteps, more voices. All three of them were on the other side of the door now, Robert could tell, whispering to each other, probably trying to decide what to do. "Dad, are you and Mom okay?" Susan's voice, pitched to sound concerned. "We came down to check on you last night, but the door was stuck. We couldn't get it open." Robert and Elaine exchanged a look. Even now, even after everything, their children were lying. "Open the door," Robert said. His voice was calm, steady. Now, another long pause. Then the click of the deadbolt sliding back. The door swung open. Michael stood in the doorway, flanked by Susan and David. They were dressed in fresh clothes, clearly showered, looking well-rested. The contrast to Robert and Elaine, soaked and shivering and still wearing their wet nightclothes, could not have been more stark. "Oh my God," Susan said, her hand flying to her mouth. "What happened?" "You're soaking wet." "The basement flooded," Michael said, as if this were news, as if he hadn't known exactly what would happen when he locked them down there during a storm. "Why didn't you call for help?" Robert looked at his eldest son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. The boy he'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager he'd driven to baseball practice, the young man he'd helped move into his first apartment. That person was gone, if he'd ever existed at all. "Move," Robert said. Michael blinked. "What?" "Move out of the doorway. We're coming up." For a moment, Michael didn't move. Robert saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. Then Michael stepped aside, and Robert and Elaine climbed the last step into their own home. The house looked different in the morning light. Or maybe Robert was seeing it differently. The furniture he and Elaine had saved for years to buy. The photographs on the walls, documenting decades of family memories. The kitchen, where they'd shared thousands of meals, raised 3 children, built a life together. Their children wanted to take this from them, were willing to terrorize them to take it. "Dad," David said, stepping forward. His voice wavered slightly. "Look, we need to talk about last night." "No." The word hung in the air. Simple, final, absolute. "No?" Susan repeated. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, we're not talking about last night. Not now. Not ever. Not with you. But I need you to leave." Robert's voice was quiet, but there was iron in it. "All 3 of you, right now." Michael stepped forward, his expression shifting from uncertain to aggressive. "Now wait a minute. We came here because we're concerned about you. You're clearly not capable of taking care of yourselves anymore. Last night proves nothing except what kind of people you've become." Elaine's voice cut through Michael's bluster like a blade. She stepped forward, placing herself beside Robert, a united front. "You locked us in that basement. You left us there knowing it would flood. You went to bed while we fought to survive. That's not—" "Don't." Elaine held up one hand. "Don't lie to me, Michael. I heard you laughing. I heard you through the floor. You thought we would be terrified, desperate, ready to sign away everything we've worked for, just to make it stop." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You were wrong." The 3 children stood frozen, their carefully planned scenario crumbling around them. Robert could see them recalculating, trying to find a new angle, a new approach. They'd inherited their mother's intelligence, if nothing else. "Mom, Dad, let's all just calm down," Susan said, her voice dropping into the soothing tone she probably used with difficult clients. "You've been through a traumatic experience. You're not thinking clearly. Why don't you get cleaned up, have some breakfast, and we can talk about this like adults." "We are talking like adults," Robert said. "We're telling you to leave our home. That's as adult as it gets. You can't just kick us out. Watch me. This is ridiculous." Michael's veneer cracked, revealing the anger underneath. "You're being completely unreasonable. We're your children. We're trying to help you." "No, you're trying to help yourselves. There's a difference." Robert walked to the front door, his wet slippers squelching on the hardwood floor, leaving a trail of basement water behind him. He opened the door and stood beside it. "Goodbye, Michael. Goodbye, Susan. Goodbye, David. I'd say it was good to see you, but we know that's not true." For a long moment, no one moved. The children stared at their father, then at their mother, then at each other, searching for some way to salvage the situation, some lever they hadn't tried, some weakness they hadn't exploited. They found nothing. David was the first to move. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door, not meeting anyone's eyes. "I'm sorry," he mumbled as he passed Robert. "I didn't want. I'm sorry." He was out the door before anyone could respond. Susan went next, her composure finally cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "You're making a mistake," she said. "You need us. You can't manage on your own." "We managed fine for 43 years before you decided we couldn't," Elaine replied. "I think we'll manage a while longer." Susan left without another word. That left Michael, standing alone in the living room, his expensive coat still hanging by the door, his expensive car still parked in the driveway. He looked at his parents, and for a moment, just a moment, Robert saw something that might have been regret. Then the mask slammed back into place. "This isn't over," Michael said. "We have legal options. If you're not capable of making decisions for yourselves, then what? You'll have us declared incompetent?" Robert shook his head slowly. "You're welcome to try, but I think you'll find that two people who survived a flooded basement using 40-year-old camping gear and bags of sand don't make very good candidates for incompetency." Michael's jaw tightened. He grabbed his coat and walked to the door, stopping just before he crossed the threshold. "You'll regret this," he said. "When you're sick or hurt and there's no one to help you, you'll wish you'd accepted our offer." Robert looked at his eldest son one last time. "Maybe," he said, "but I don't think so." Michael left. The door closed behind him, and Robert and Elaine were alone in their home. The silence after the children left was unlike any silence Robert had ever experienced. It wasn't empty. It was full, somehow, weighted with everything that had happened and everything that would never happen again. He stood at the closed door for a long time, his hand still on the knob, listening to the sounds of 3 cars starting, 3 engines revving, 3 sets of tires crunching down the gravel driveway and away. Away from the house they'd grown up in, away from the parents who had given them everything, away from any possibility of reconciliation. "Robert." Elaine's voice was gentle, pulling him back from wherever he'd gone. "Robert, you need to get out of those wet clothes. We both do. We'll catch pneumonia standing here like this." She was right. She was always right. But Robert couldn't seem to make his body move. The adrenaline that had carried him through the night, through the confrontation, was draining away, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound it felt like gravity had doubled. "I know," he said. "I know. I just need a minute." Elaine came to stand beside him, her wet nightgown clinging to her thin frame, her gray hair plastered against her head. She looked every one of her 71 years at that moment, but she also looked strong, unbroken, alive. "Take all the minutes you need," she said. "I'll start the coffee." She moved toward the kitchen, and Robert finally found the strength to follow. The house felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because something fundamental had shifted. The photographs on the walls, the ones showing Michael's graduation and Susan's wedding and David's first Little League trophy, looked like artifacts from someone else's life. A life that had ended sometime during the night without Robert fully realizing it. He changed out of his wet clothes in the bedroom, moving slowly, his body reminding him of every year it had carried him through. The hot shower helped, warming muscles that had gone cold hours ago, washing away the basement water and something else, something he couldn't name but could feel leaving him. When he came downstairs, Elaine was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a look on her face that Robert recognized. It was her thinking look, the one she got when she was working through a problem. "We need to call a lawyer," she said without preamble. "Today, before they have a chance to do whatever Michael was threatening." Robert sat down across from her and wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "It's Sunday. Then we call first thing Monday morning. I want this house protected. I want our finances protected. I want it in writing that they have no claim to anything we've built. They're our children, Elaine. They were our children." Her voice cracked on the words, the first real sign of the pain she'd been holding back. "The people who left here this morning, I don't know who they are, but they're not the babies I nursed, not the toddlers I chased around this kitchen, not the teenagers I stayed up late worrying about. Those children are gone. Maybe they were never really there." Robert reached across the table and took her hand. "They were there, I remember them. I remember Michael building that birdhouse with me when he was 8. I remember Susan learning to ride her bike in the driveway. I remember David falling asleep in my lap every Christmas Eve because he was too excited to sleep in his own bed. I remember, too. Tears were streaming down Elaine's face now, silent and steady. That's what makes this so hard. If they'd always been cruel, always been selfish, it would be easier. But they weren't. They were good children once. Somewhere along the way we lost them, or they lost themselves. Does it matter which? Robert considered the question. Did it matter? Would knowing exactly when and how his children had transformed into people capable of locking their elderly parents in a flooding basement change anything? Would it undo the betrayal? Would it make the future any clearer? No, he said finally. I don't suppose it does. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee and watching the morning light strengthen outside the kitchen window. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving behind a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Birds were returning to the feeder in the backyard, the one Robert had built 15 years ago and maintained ever since. Life continued. Even after the worst nights, life continued. I need to check the basement, Robert said, eventually. See how bad the damage is. The insurance company will want documentation. I'll come with you. They descended the stairs together, moving slowly, supporting each other on the steep steps. The basement looked worse in daylight than it had in the darkness, the water damage clearly visible on everything below the high-water mark. Ruined boxes, warped shelving, the old camping gear destroyed beyond salvage. But the air mattress was still there, deflated now but intact. And the workbench where they'd huddled through the worst of it still stood, solid and reliable as ever. We should keep it, Elaine said, nodding toward the mattress. Frame it or something? A reminder. Of what? The worst night of our lives? Of the night we survived, the night we proved we were stronger than they thought. Robert looked at the mattress, really looked at it, and understood what she meant. It wasn't a symbol of their suffering, it was a symbol of their endurance. Their refusal to give up, even when giving up would have been so easy. Okay, he said, we'll keep it. They spent the rest of the morning documenting the damage. Robert took photographs with the old digital camera they'd bought years ago and barely used. Elaine made lists, her handwriting neat and precise despite everything, cataloging what had been lost and what could be salvaged. The basement would need professional restoration. That much was clear. The foundation would need proper repair, not just Robert's emergency patches. It would cost money they didn't really have, but they'd find a way. They always found a way. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. Robert and Elaine exchanged a look. Neither of them moved. They wouldn't come back, Elaine said, but her voice was uncertain. Not after this morning. They might. Michael doesn't like losing. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Robert walked to the door. His heart rate elevated despite his attempts to stay calm. He looked through the peephole, expecting to see one of his children's faces. Instead, he saw Margaret Chen, their neighbor from 3 houses down. He opened the door to find Margaret holding a casserole dish, her face creased with concern. Robert, thank God you're all right. We saw the cars this morning, and then we saw them leave so quickly. And Frank said I should mind my own business, but I couldn't stop thinking about you two alone in this big house during that terrible storm. We're fine, Margaret. A little worse for wear, but fine. The basement flooded, didn't it? Ours did too. Frank's been down there all morning with the shop vac. Here, I made a chicken casserole. You need to eat something hot after a night like that. Robert took the casserole dish, touched by the gesture despite his exhaustion. The Chens had been their neighbors for 20 years, pleasant but not particularly close. Yet here was Margaret, checking on them, bringing food, caring about their well-being in a way their own children hadn't. Thank you, he said. That's very kind. It's nothing. It's what neighbors do. She peered past him into the house. Is Elaine all right? Do you need help with anything? Frank's pretty handy. He could take a look at whatever needs fixing. We're managing, but thank you, really. Margaret nodded, then hesitated. Robert, I don't mean to pry, but those were your children's cars this morning, weren't they? All 3 of them? Yes. They didn't stay long. No, they didn't. Margaret's expression shifted, something knowing entering her eyes. I see. Well, if you need anything at all, you know where to find us. And I mean anything, Robert, day or night. After she left, Robert stood holding the casserole dish, thinking about the strange arithmetic of human kindness. 3 children who had tried to terrorize them into surrender. 1 neighbor who had brought food and offered help without being asked. Maybe blood wasn't as thick as everyone claimed. The lawyer's name was Patricia Okonkwo, and she came highly recommended by Frank Chen, who'd used her for his own estate planning. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner that Robert immediately appreciated. They met in her office on Monday afternoon, Robert and Elaine sitting side by side across her desk, explaining what had happened. Patricia listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression betraying nothing. When they finished, she set down her pen and looked at them for a long moment. "Let me make sure I understand," she said. "Your 3 adult children locked you in your basement during a severe storm, knowing the basement had flooding issues, and left you there overnight while they slept in your house." "That's correct," Robert said. "And their motive was to frighten you into agreeing to move into assisted living and sign over the house. That's what they said." We heard them talking through the floor. Patricia nodded slowly. "What you've described could potentially constitute unlawful imprisonment, reckless endangerment, and possibly elder abuse under Pennsylvania law. You could file criminal charges." Robert and Elaine exchanged a look. "We don't want to send our children to prison," Elaine said quietly. "We just want to protect ourselves. And our home. I understand. And there are ways to do that without criminal prosecution, though I want you to know that option exists if you change your mind." Patricia pulled out a folder. "First, we update your wills and estate plans. Right now, I'm assuming your children are your beneficiaries?" "They were," Robert said. "Equal thirds. We changed that. You can leave your estate to charity, to other family members, to anyone you choose. Your children have no legal right to your property while you're alive, and with proper estate planning, they'll have no claim to it after you're gone." "Can they challenge that?" Elaine asked. "Michael threatened to have us declared incompetent." Patricia smiled, a thin expression that held no warmth. "They can try, but here's the thing about competency hearings. They require evidence of mental incapacity. What you've described to me, surviving a flooding basement through resourcefulness and cooperation, doesn't exactly scream incompetence. If anything, it demonstrates the opposite." "What if they lie?" Robert asked. "What if they claim we locked ourselves in by accident, that we're confused and making up stories? That's why we document everything now, while the evidence is fresh. Photographs of the basement, of the deadbolt that was engaged from the outside, of the water damage. Written statements from both of you. Medical records from your doctors, confirming your mental acuity. We build a paper trail so comprehensive that any claims of incompetence will be laughed out of court." They spent 3 hours in Patricia's office, making decisions that would have seemed unthinkable a week ago. The children were removed from the will entirely, the house and all assets left to a charitable foundation that supported elderly abuse victims. A trust was established to manage their finances, with Patricia named as trustee, ensuring that no one could pressure them into signing away their resources. It was brutal work, legally severing the ties to people they had created and raised and loved. But it was necessary. Robert understood that now. "One more thing," Patricia said as they were preparing to leave. "I'd recommend installing security cameras around your property. Document anyone who comes to the house. If your children attempt to contact you or come onto your property after you've asked them to leave, we'll have evidence." "You think they'll come back?" Elaine asked. "I think people who lock their elderly parents in a flooded basement aren't likely to give up after one failed attempt. They've shown you who they are. Believe them." The security cameras were installed that Wednesday, small and discreet, covering every approach to the house. Frank Chen helped with the technical setup, his quiet competence a comfort after the chaos of the past few days. "You know," Frank said as he adjusted the angle of the front door camera, "Margaret and I have been talking about what happened. You don't have to tell us the details, but we want you to know that we're here, whatever you need." Robert watched his neighbor work, this man he'd exchanged pleasantries with for 2 decades, but never really known. "Why?" he asked. We've barely been more than acquaintances all these years. Frank paused, considering the question. My mother lived alone after my father died. She was stubborn, independent, and didn't want help from anyone. One winter, she fell on the ice outside her apartment, broke her hip, lay there for 6 hours before someone found her. I'm sorry. She survived, but it changed her. Made her realize she couldn't do everything alone. Frank resumed his work on the camera. You and Elaine, you're not alone. Maybe we haven't been close, but that doesn't mean we don't care. That doesn't mean we won't help if you need it. We might need it, Robert admitted. More than we'd like. That's okay. That's what neighbors are for. The basement restoration began the following week. A professional crew came in, pumped out the remaining water, treated the concrete for mold, and repaired the foundation properly, not with emergency patches and bags of sand, but with the right materials and expertise. It was expensive, more expensive than Robert had feared, but Patricia had helped them access a home equity line of credit, and the insurance covered some of the damage, and somehow they managed. They always managed. 3 weeks after the storm, David appeared at the front door. Robert saw him on the security camera feed, standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets, looking like a child waiting to be punished. He was alone, no sign of Michael or Susan. Robert considered not answering. He'd told all 3 of them to leave and not come back. He had every right to ignore the knock, to let his youngest son stand there until he gave up and went away. But something made him open the door. David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, his face haggard. He'd lost weight since Robert had last seen him, and he hadn't had much to lose. Dad, he said, I know you don't want to see me. I know I don't deserve to be here. But I needed to say something, and I couldn't do it over the phone or in a letter. I needed to say it to your face. Robert said nothing. He simply waited. I'm sorry, David's voice cracked. I'm so sorry. What we did, what I helped them do, it was wrong. It was evil. I've been trying to tell myself I didn't have a choice, that Michael and Susan pressured me into it, but that's not true. I could have said no. I could have warned you. I could have unlocked the door in the middle of the night when they were asleep, but I didn't. I was too weak and too scared, and I let them hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. Robert studied his son's face, looking for signs of manipulation, the tricks he'd seen Susan and Michael employ so effectively. But all he saw was grief, raw, unfiltered grief. Why are you really here, David? Because I haven't been able to sleep. Because every time I close my eyes, I hear the storm, and I think about you and Mom trapped down there in the dark and the water, and I want to die from the shame of it. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve that. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. That I know what we did was unforgivable. That I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And Michael and Susan? Are they sorry too? David's expression shifted, something bitter entering his eyes. Michael thinks you'll come around eventually, that you'll get tired of managing on your own and call us for help. Susan thinks you're being dramatic, that the whole thing wasn't as bad as you're making it sound. He shook his head. They don't get it. They don't understand what they've done. Maybe they never will. But you understand. I understand that I had parents who loved me my entire life, and when they needed me most, I betrayed them. I understand that there's nothing I can do to make that right. I understand that I have to live with that for the rest of my life. Robert looked at his youngest son for a long moment. The boy who had always been the softest, the most easily led, the one who craved approval above all else. The boy who had followed his siblings into an act of cruelty he'd known was wrong. Go home, David, Robert said finally. Dad, I heard what you said, and maybe someday I'll be able to do something with it, but not today. Today, I need you to go home and leave us in peace. David nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. I understand. Can you tell Mom I'm sorry? I don't expect her to believe me, but I need her to know. I'll tell her. Thank you. David turned to go, then stopped. Dad, for what it's worth, I'm glad you survived. Both of you. When I saw you come up those stairs the next morning, alive and strong, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt proud of you. Proud to be your son, even though I'd just proven I didn't deserve to be. He walked down the steps and got into his car. Robert watched him drive away, then closed the door and went to find Elaine. She was in the kitchen, where she'd been listening through the window. "You heard?" Robert asked. "I heard. What do you think?" Elaine was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "I think he's genuinely sorry, but I also think sorry doesn't undo what happened. Sorry doesn't give us back the children we thought we raised. Sorry doesn't make me feel safe in my own home. No, it doesn't. Maybe someday I'll feel differently. Maybe time will soften the edges of this, enough that I can look at David without seeing the person who helped lock us in that basement. But that day isn't today, and I don't know if it will ever come." Robert sat down across from her, in the same seat where they'd eaten thousands of meals together, discussed thousands of problems, shared thousands of moments, both mundane and profound. "Whatever you decide," he said, "I'm with you. If you want to never see any of them again, I'll support that. If you want to try to rebuild something with David someday, I'll support that too. This is your choice to make, Elaine. Not mine, not theirs, yours." Elaine reached across the table and took his hand. "Our choice," she corrected. "Everything we do from now on, we do together. That's what got us through that basement. That's what will get us through whatever comes next." Spring arrived slowly that year, winter clinging to the hills around Cedarbrook with stubborn persistence. But eventually the snow melted, and the trees budded, and the world remembered how to be green again. Robert stood on the back porch, watching the birds at the feeder he'd maintained for 15 years. The house was quiet behind him, Elaine napping in the living room, the afternoon sun warming the floorboards through the windows. They'd made it through. Not just the storm, not just the basement, but the aftermath. The legal battles Michael had threatened never materialized, perhaps because Patricia had made clear how badly they would go for him. Susan had sent a single letter, 3 pages of justification and blame-shifting that Elaine had read once and then burned in the kitchen sink. David called occasionally, short conversations that Robert kept civil but distant, leaving the door open a crack without inviting anyone through. The house was theirs, life was theirs, and slowly, day by day, they were learning to live it without the children they'd thought would be part of it forever. Margaret Chen came by twice a week now, sometimes with casseroles, sometimes just to talk. Frank had helped Robert build a raised garden bed, easier on the knees than bending down to ground level, and they were planning to plant tomatoes and peppers when the soil warmed. Other neighbors had started stopping by too, people Robert had known for years but never really connected with, drawn together by the strange alchemy of crisis and community. "You look peaceful," Elaine said from the doorway behind him. Robert turned to see her standing there, wrapped in a cardigan he'd given her for Christmas 20 years ago, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. "I am peaceful," he said. "I didn't expect to be, but I am." She came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. They watched the birds together, a cardinal and 2 sparrows competing for space on the feeder. "I've been thinking," Elaine said. "About what?" "About what Patricia said, about the charitable foundation, the one we're leaving everything to. What about it? I want to do more than just leave them money when we're gone. I want to help now. There must be other people like us, elderly people being pressured or abused by their families. Maybe we could volunteer, or donate, or just talk to people who are going through what we went through. Let them know they're not alone." Robert considered this. "You want to turn our worst night into something that helps others. I want to make it mean something. Otherwise, it's just pain, just loss. But if we can use it, if we can help even one person survive what we survived, then maybe something good comes out of all this ugliness." Robert squeezed her hand. "I think that's a wonderful idea." "You do?" "I do, and I think we should do it together." Elaine smiled, the same smile he'd fallen in love with 50 years ago on the steps of the public library, the smile that had carried him through every hard day since. "Together," she agreed. "That's how we do everything." They stood on the porch as the afternoon faded toward evening, 2 old people who had been betrayed by their own blood and survived to tell the story. The house stood solid behind them, repaired and restored, still theirs after 43 years and 1 terrible night. Robert thought about the air mattress, still sitting in the corner of the basement where Elaine had insisted they keep it. A reminder, she'd said, of what they'd survived, of who they were when everything else was stripped away. They were survivors. They were partners. They were each other's chosen family when the family they'd created chose to betray them. And that, Robert understood now, was more than enough.